In Seoul, defeat can look remarkably like victory if you're patient enough to wait for the final act. 3 years ago, everyone believed Min Seo-jun had destroyed me, stripped away my position, my reputation, my carefully built career in Korea's most prestigious investment firm. What they didn't realize was that I had let him think he'd won. My name is Sarah Chen. And this was the moment I realized I hadn't just been pushed aside, I had been quietly erased. And tonight, as I watch Korea's most powerful corporate empire crumble from the inside out, I want to tell you about the difference between losing a battle and winning a war. Sometimes the most dangerous move you can make is to let your opponent believe they've already defeated you. The rain falls against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, yes, my office now, as I review the final documents that will complete what I started 36 months ago. Below me, Seoul stretches out in a tapestry of light and shadow, and somewhere in this glittering maze, Min Seo-jun is finally understanding that everything he built his legacy on has been carefully dismantled by the woman he dismissed as irrelevant. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, I need to take you back to where it all began. 3 years ago, I was the youngest senior analyst at Daehan Capital, Seoul's most influential investment firm. For 5 years, I had navigated the complex hierarchy of Korean corporate culture as a Korean-American woman who'd returned from Wall Street with both ambition and the expertise to back it up. My research had generated over 2 billion won in profits for the firm, and my insights into international markets had positioned Daehan as a leader in cross-border investments. Min Seo-jun was the heir apparent to the Daehan empire, a man whose family had built the firm from a small trading company into a financial powerhouse that influenced everything from government policy to major corporate mergers. He was intelligent, Harvard-educated, and possessed the kind of quiet authority that made rooms go silent when he entered. He was also someone who saw my success as a threat to the natural order he'd inherited. The first signs of what was coming appeared in subtle ways that I initially attributed to cultural adjustment challenges. My recommendations began requiring additional approvals that slowed their implementation. Key client meetings started happening without my involvement, despite my expertise being central to the relationships. My research reports were edited in ways that diminished their impact before reaching senior leadership. What makes this moment particularly significant is that I recognized these patterns not as random organizational changes, but as a systematic campaign to marginalize my influence within the firm. Min Seo-jun was too sophisticated to engage in obvious discrimination or direct confrontation. Instead, he was employing a strategy of gradual exclusion designed to make my position untenable while maintaining plausible deniability. The final move came during our presentation to the National Pension Service about a major infrastructure investment opportunity one had identified and developed over 8 months. It was the kind of deal that could define a career, complex, highly profitable, and requiring exactly the type of international market analysis that had become my specialty. I arrived at the conference room 15 minutes early, as was my habit, only to find the presentation already in progress. Min Seo-jun was delivering my analysis, using my research, presenting my recommendations as his own work. When I quietly entered the room, he acknowledged me with a polite nod and continued without missing a beat. "Sarah, excellent timing," he said smoothly. "I was just explaining to our colleagues how your administrative support on this project has been invaluable." Administrative support. 5 years of building expertise, 8 months of developing this specific opportunity, reduced to administrative support in a single, precisely calculated phrase. Here's where perception begins to shift. The room full of senior executives, people who had worked with me for years, who knew my capabilities, said nothing. Not because they agreed with the characterization, but because challenging Min Seo-jun's version of events would require questioning the authority of the man positioned to inherit control of the entire firm. I could have protested. I could have demanded credit for my work. I could have created a confrontation that might have resulted in short-term vindication but would have ultimately confirmed me as a disruptive element that couldn't work within established hierarchies. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I smiled graciously and said, "I'm honored to have contributed to such an important project. Mr. Min's leadership on this initiative has been exceptional." The presentation concluded with unanimous approval for the investment. Min Seo-jun received congratulations for his brilliant analysis and strategic thinking. I received polite thanks for my support role. 2 weeks later, I was quietly transferred to a consulting position with reduced responsibilities and minimal client contact. The official explanation cited organizational restructuring and evolving role definitions. The unofficial reality was that I had been effectively exiled from the core of Daehan's operations. Most people assumed this was the end of my story at Daehan Capital. What they didn't understand was that it was actually the beginning of something much more strategic. This is where the real tension begins to build. Because while Min Seo-jun believed he had neutralized a threat to his authority, he had actually created something far more dangerous, a highly skilled analyst with intimate knowledge of his organization's operations and no remaining loyalty to its success. My new consulting role, while clearly intended to marginalize me, this was when I stopped thinking like a survivor and started thinking like a strategist. I actually provided something invaluable: flexibility. I could work with external clients, travel internationally, and maintain relationships throughout Seoul's financial sector without the restrictions that governed full-time employees at Daehan. More importantly, my apparent defeat had made me invisible to Min Seo-jun. He no longer saw me as a threat worth monitoring, which meant he no longer paid attention to what I was actually doing with my time and expertise. What I was doing was building a network of relationships that would eventually become the foundation for everything that followed. I began consulting for Daehan's competitors, not in ways that violated any legal or ethical boundaries, but in ways that demonstrated my value to organizations that might benefit from my international market expertise. I helped smaller investment firms develop more sophisticated analysis capabilities. I advised foreign companies seeking to enter Korean markets about local partnership opportunities. Most importantly, I began identifying and cultivating relationships with the key stakeholders whose decisions would ultimately determine Daehan's future success: pension fund managers, government officials responsible for financial oversight, international partners considering Korean market investments. The real strategy wasn't revenge in any traditional sense. It was patience. It was positioning myself as an indispensable resource to everyone except the organization that had dismissed me, while carefully documenting every instance where my absence was causing Daehan to miss opportunities or make suboptimal decisions. Here's why this approach proved so effective. Min Seo-jun's strategy had been based on the assumption that my value to Daehan was contained within Daehan's organizational structure. By removing me from that structure, he believed he had eliminated whatever threat I represented. What he hadn't considered was that my real value lay in my relationships, my expertise, and my reputation within the broader Korean and international financial communities. Those assets didn't disappear when I was marginalized at Daehan, they became available to everyone else. The first cracks in Min Seo-jun's position became visible about 8 months after my transfer. The infrastructure investment I had identified and developed was encountering implementation challenges that could have been anticipated with more thorough international market analysis. The type of analysis that had been my specialty. Daehan's international partnerships were struggling because the firm lacked deep expertise in cross-cultural business development. The type of expertise I had spent 5 years developing. Most significantly, several major clients were beginning to question Daehan's analytical capabilities as market conditions shifted in ways that required exactly the kind of sophisticated international perspective that I had previously provided. Min Seo-jun's response to these challenges was to hire additional consultants and analysts, trying to replace my expertise with multiple external resources. But expertise isn't just technical knowledge, it's understanding, relationships, and intuition developed over years of experience. You can't replicate that by hiring more people. Meanwhile, I was thriving in my consulting role, building a reputation that extended far beyond anything I had achieved while working within Daehan's organizational constraints. My client base included some of Korea's most successful companies, several government ministries, and multiple international firms seeking Korean market opportunities. What makes this particularly satisfying is that I was succeeding not despite being dismissed from Daehan, but because being dismissed had forced me to develop capabilities I never would have explored while working within their limitations. The turning point came 18 months after my transfer, when Korea's National Pension Service announced a massive new infrastructure investment initiative that would reshape the country's economic development strategy for the next decade. As one of the few analysts in Seoul with both international infrastructure expertise and deep relationships within the pension fund management structure, I was invited to join the advisory committee that would evaluate and recommend investment opportunities. Min Seo-jun, representing Daehan Capital, was also appointed to the committee. For the first time in 18 months, we were working in the same room again. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I was there as an independent expert whose recommendations would influence billions of won in investment decisions. He was there as a representative of a firm that was increasingly seen as lacking the international expertise necessary for complex global opportunities. The real psychological tension wasn't about confrontation or vindication. It was about competence. Every analysis I presented, every insight I offered, every question I asked highlighted the growing gap between my capabilities and Daehan's current analytical resources. Min Seo-jun was intelligent enough to recognize what was happening, but positioned poorly to address it. He couldn't acknowledge my expertise without implicitly admitting that dismissing me had been a mistake. He couldn't match my insights without the international relationships and experience that I had developed. He couldn't undermine my recommendations without damaging his own credibility with the pension fund leadership. This is where everything begins to accelerate toward the final resolution. Over the following months, 3 things happened simultaneously that transformed the competitive landscape in Seoul's investment management sector. First, several of Korea's most prestigious companies began shifting their investment advisory relationships away from Daehan toward firms that could provide more sophisticated international market analysis. The type of analysis they had previously received from me before I was marginalized. Second, multiple international partners who had worked with Daehan specifically because of my involvement began questioning whether the firm still possessed the expertise necessary for complex cross-border transactions. Third, government agencies responsible for major investment decisions began requesting specific analytical capabilities that Daehan could no longer provide at the level they had come to expect. Min Seo-jun found himself managing a firm whose reputation had been built partly on capabilities that no longer existed within the organization. He was losing clients, partners, and opportunities not because of any dramatic failure, but because the market had evolved beyond Daehan's current expertise. The final sequence of events unfolded over 6 months with the precise timing that had characterized everything I had built toward this moment. Korea's National Pension Service announced that they were restructuring their advisory relationships to focus on firms with proven international expertise and innovative analytical capabilities. Daehan Capital, despite its prestigious history, was not selected for renewal. 3 major Korean conglomerates announced they were consolidating their investment advisory relationships with firms that could provide integrated domestic and international market analysis. All 3 chose competitors who employed analysts I had helped train and develop. Most significantly, the Minister of Economy and Finance announced a new initiative to promote Korean companies' international expansion by connecting them with advisory services that combined local market knowledge with global expertise. The initiative would be managed through a consortium of investment firms specifically selected for their international capabilities. I was invited to lead the consortium's analytical division. Min Seo-jun's firm was not invited to participate. The moment when everything crystallized came during a reception celebrating the launch of the International Expansion Initiative. Min Seo-jun approached me near the end of the evening, after he had spent 2 hours watching Korea's business and political leadership treat me as an essential resource for the country's economic future. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think it's time we discussed bringing you back to Daehan. Your expertise would be valuable as we restructure our international advisory capabilities." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had systematically marginalized me, stolen credit for my work, and then dismissed me when I became inconvenient to his authority. "Min Seo-jun," I replied calmly, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure Daehan has the organizational structure to support the kind of work I'm doing now." "What do you mean?" "I mean that 3 years ago, you had the opportunity to work with someone who could have helped build Daehan into the most sophisticated international advisory firm in Korea. Instead, you chose to protect your position by eliminating what you saw as competition." His face remained composed, but I could see the recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. "The infrastructure investment that launched my reputation in government circles," I continued. "The international partnerships that established my credibility with global firms. The analytical methodologies that everyone now considers industry standard. All of that was developed while I was supposedly relegated to administrative support." In his silence, I saw it, not anger, not defeat, but recognition. "You planned this," he said, not accusingly but with the kind of professional respect one strategist gives to another. "I planned to succeed," I corrected. "Whether that came through Daehan or despite Daehan was always your choice to make. Here's what makes this resolution particularly meaningful. I hadn't destroyed Min Seo-jun or Daehan Capital through any dramatic confrontation or vindictive scheme. I had simply built something better while they stagnated, created more value while they tried to protect existing advantages, developed capabilities while they focused on maintaining hierarchies. The real victory wasn't defeating them, it was making their defeat irrelevant to my own success." 6 months later, I opened my own investment advisory firm focused on facilitating Korean companies' international expansion and foreign investment in Korean markets. My client base included most of the relationships I had developed over 3 years of consulting work, plus several major accounts that had shifted away from Daehan when their analytical capabilities proved insufficient. Min Seo-jun, facing pressure from Dehan's board of directors to address the firm's declining market position, eventually stepped down from his executive role to focus on strategic planning and business development. He was replaced by someone with extensive international experience who immediately began restructuring the firm's analytical capabilities. As I write this story now, 2 years after launching my own firm, I think about what I learned during those 3 years when everyone believed I had lost everything that mattered to my career. What I learned was that losing a position is not the same as losing your capabilities. Being dismissed from an organization is not the same as being eliminated from an industry. Having someone steal credit for your work doesn't diminish your ability to create new work that surpasses everything you've done before. Most importantly, I learned that the most sustainable form of victory comes not from defeating your opponents, but from making their opposition irrelevant to your continued success. Min Seo-jun had tried to control his environment by eliminating threats to his authority. But control based on exclusion is fundamentally limited because it depends on containing variables rather than excelling despite them. The approach I chose, building capabilities that made me indispensable to everyone except the organization that had dismissed me, created sustainable advantages that couldn't be taken away through organizational restructuring or political maneuvering. Today, my firm is recognized as one of Seoul's premier international investment advisories. We've facilitated over 50 major cross-border transactions, advised on government policy initiatives, and trained the next generation of analysts who will shape Korea's economic relationships with the global community. Min Seo-jun and I occasionally encounter each other at industry events. Our interactions are professionally cordial, and I believe he has developed genuine respect for what I've built. More importantly, I think he understands that what happened between us was never really about personal conflict. It was about different approaches to managing talent, developing expertise, and responding to competitive challenges. The lesson from my story isn't about revenge or vindication. It's about the difference between short-term control and long-term influence, between protecting existing positions and building new capabilities, between seeing talent as a threat to manage or as an asset to develop. Everyone thought I lost when Min Seo-jun marginalized my role at Daehan Capital. What they didn't understand was that being forced to leave that protected environment was exactly what I needed to discover what I was truly capable of achieving. Sometimes the greatest victory is being underestimated by people who mistake their temporary authority for permanent advantage. Because while they're focused on maintaining what they have, you're free to build something they never imagined was possible. And when they finally realize what you've accomplished, it's not defeat they feel, it's recognition of exactly what they lost when they decided you weren't worth keeping. Stories like this don't happen by accident, they happen through patience, strategy, and choice. If you enjoyed this kind of intelligent, female-led power story, subscribe now. These are not surface-level stories, and the next one may change how you see control entirely.